Um, it's a daf pei in Masechet Chullin. We're sitting outside in Lakeville, Connecticut. It's very nice. So yesterday we ended with a shocking twist, let's say, in this saga. Because 2 days ago we had a machloket about whether you care about zera ha'av, how much you care about the father's input. Does otovet beno mean a mother and a child or a father and a child? Yesterday we had a machloket which seemed very similar between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about mixed animals, right? Kilayim animals, whether it's a chayiv and matanot to the kohen, because remember we had a koi was the big animal, which is a mix of a chaya and a behema, right? And so when you have an animal that's a mix of a chaya and a behema, it's very confusing because a chaya you don't have to give matanot to kuna, behema you do. A chaya needs kisui hadam, a behema doesn't. And so you need to know on Yom Tif or for a kohen whether this is a chaya or a behema. And obviously, you have to not determine whether the mother is the only one that matters or the mother and the father matter and to what extent. So that's what we discussed yesterday. We ended up concluding at the top yesterday that everyone agreed that we have no idea. That both Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer said we aren't unsure how much the father's opinion matters. Um, the father's input, I guess, DNA matters. And the question really is, if an animal is partially a seh, right, or partially a chaya, does that make you chayav in half of matzot kuna, for example, if it's a half a chaya, or if it's partially a seh, is it chayav in right, that's right, in matzot kuna. If it's partially a chaya, is it chayav in kisoy hadam? So we don't know. So let's read now Rav Papa, the third line from Daf Pei Amud Aleph. I'm Rav Papa. Now that that's the situation, Hilkach. Given this background, le'inyan kisoy hadam umatanot. In regards to the responsibility to cover the blood, which is only for a chaya, on Yom Tif in this case, of course. If it's not Yom Tif, you just cover it. But if it's Yom Tif, or matanot, or giving a gift to the Kohen, lo mishkachat ela b'tzvi haba hayasha. The explanation of Machloket, the Rabbanan, Rebbe Eliezer, is in a case where the father is a tzvi, is a deer, a chaya. The mother is a tayasha, a goat, and there's a child, which we call a koi. So there's definitely a mother that was a behema, right? Bein the Rabbanan, Bein the Rebbe Eliezer, misafkalu. They're unsure how much of a chaya exists in this animal. So I choshin zaravu olo. Become miflagi b'seh, afilu b'miksatzeh. The argument is if an animal is a partial seh, meaning it might have a father that's a chaya, or it does have a father that's a chaya, it might count, and therefore it's only a partial seh, does that make it lose its criteria of giving matanot kahuna, right? So the where am I? Linyan otovet beno, or no, sorry, skip. Yeah, that's the case. So according to the Chachamim, it seva afilu miksat seh. So it doesn't matter if the father is a chaya. For sure, the mother is a sen. You have to give at least 50% matanot kuna. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's a suffix, and the Kohen would have to prove that it's completely a seh. And since the Kohen can't prove that, you wouldn't have to give anything to the Kohen. And same thing by kisoy adam. Linyan otovet beno. Now, in regards to the other halacha, which was a previous braita of our Mishnah of Otovet Beno, Mishkachatla, then you could find the machloket Bein B'Tayasha Ba'al Tzviya. Doesn't matter which one is the mother or the father, whether the father is a goat in this case and the mother's a deer, Bein B'Tzviya Ba'al Tayasha, or the opposite. How do you have that? B'Tayasha Ba'al Tzviya. If the father is a goat and the mother's a deer, then the question is Isura. The question is whether that it's otovet beno, meaning whether if you shech that animal, you then have a problem. Remember, shechting the grandchild, right? The third level, because obviously the isura. The Rabbanan Savri, dilma choshishim l'zera'av. You might have to worry about the father, in which case this animal, which came from a goat and a deer, is a seva filo miktzat samrinan, and it would be asur to shech that animal and its child on one day. And Rabbi Eliezer Savar Nehina midechoshin l'zera'av. Sure, it might be that its father was a goat, and you care about that. But half a goat is not a goat. Seva filos mixat seh lo amrinan. So therefore, it is not a seh, and it is not subject to otovet beno. And the opposite case is tzvi haba tayasha, where the mother is a goat and the father is a tzvi. There, the question is the malkot. Do you get makot for doing otovet beno? Abanan savri nehinam yichoshin zera'av. Sure, you have to worry about the father, but seva filo mixat seh amrinan umalkinale. For sure. The father's a deer, right? So this animal's may be partially a deer, but it's for sure a seh umniksat seh, and therefore, because the mother's a tayasha, and therefore you get makot. And Rabbi Eliezer holds, well, it's true, it's isura ika. You definitely can't shecht it because it might be a goat. It's definitely partially a goat, but meaning it might be a goat, sorry, because its mother was a goat and the father was a deer, but if the father's ignored, then it's just a goat. and then otovet bno applies. But you certainly couldn't give makot leka because you don't know for sure, right? Excuse me. So sur ika dilma choshesh ein choshim zera'av. Maybe according to Rebbe Eliezer and Rabbanan, you don't worry about the father's input. And this is basically because its mother was a tayasha, it is a goat, a seh. And therefore, otovet bno, you get makot. But the reality is you can't give makot because makot leka, because dilma choshim zera'av. Maybe you do have to worry about the father's contribution. And this is a mixed animal, a seh and a deer, which we call a koi. But that's not enough to be in chayv makot because seh v'afilu mixed seh lo aminan. You don't include an animal that's only a partial seh in the prohibition of seh or shar or seh, right? According to Reb Eliezer. Okay, so that is the way you explain everything we learned yesterday. Good morning, Miriam and Robert. We are, I'm trying to think, look, around 12 to the last of the narrow lines, where Tosfot says Harishon, just to the right of that in the Vilna Shas. Amar Rav Yehuda. Now says Rav Yehuda, I disagree with this whole discussion that you've had, right? This whole discussion revolved around the fact that you have a deer and a goat that mate together and have a baby that may be a partial deer and a partial goat, maybe a partial chaya, partial behema. Says Rav Yehuda, it's impossible. It doesn't happen, right? There's no such thing as an offspring that comes from a chaya and a behema, which seems to be more consistent with the reality of Wikipedia, I guess. So says Rav Yehuda, koi birya b'fnei atzmahi. A koi is its own species. A koi is not a product. It's a weird-looking animal that has features of a chaya and a behema. So therefore, people said, "Oh, it came from a chaya and a behema." But the reality is, it's its own species. But we can't tell. We just don't know if it's a domestic animal or if it's a wild animal, and that has huge implications for kisoy adam and for matnot kuna and for well, maybe for otobet no, because it has to be a seh, right? So it has all these implications, but we basically are machmir because we don't know what to do. Rav Nachman says, sorry, Rav Yehuda is a Amora, we just quoted. Rav Nachman says, koi zeh ayal habar. The koi is, I know exactly what a koi is. It's a wild goat. Is that what you're saying, ayal?
Yeah.
A wild goat, right? Bar means from the forest. So it's a wild goat, which means that it's essentially a behema, but it has features, maybe through evolution and behavior, that make it more wild. But it just looks that way, but it is definitely considered a behema. And kitnai, in fact, there's a machloket tanaim that talks all about this thing. It says the Braita, koi ze ayal bar. Just like Rav Nachman said. Yesh omrim, some people say, no, it actually is a mixed breed. Ze haba min hatayash u'min hatzviya. It's an animal that comes from a mixture of a tayash, a goat, and a deer, right? Which is what we've been saying till now. And Rabbi Yossi says, what Rav Yehuda said, koi birya b'fnei atzmahi. In fact, it's its own distinct species, but we don't know. We don't know which category it goes into. And says the Braita, a fourth opinion, it's always good to have many opinions, right? Says the Braita, one more opinion is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, min behimahi, I have no questions. It is a behema, and shall beit dushai hayimegadlam and adarim. And the beit dushai, they would raise flocks and flocks of these animals, meaning that they're raisable, right? They're domestic, and they are treated like behema. It's just an odd behema, but don't discriminate against it for that reason. Continues the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Safra, Amar Hamnuna, Hani Izi de Ize, thank you, de Bala, right? Ize de Bala, Ize, of course, are goats. Bala, Rashi says, means the forest, right? Bala is a yar, Rashi says. So goats of the forest, or wild mountain goats, as we may call them, doesn't say mountains, but that's the idea, I guess. Ksherot the Gavi Mizbeach. They are considered to be kosher for the Mizbeach. Remember the criteria for being kosher for the Mizbeach. You have to be a kosher animal, of course, but you also have to be a behema. Chayot are never brought on wild animals are never brought on the mizbeach. So these wild goats are considered to be behemot, domesticated animals, or whatever we call behema. And that is several hadar of Amar Rav Yitzchak. In fact, this is based on the very interesting statement of Rav Yitzchak. We're at the last narrow line, which Rav Yitzchak points out that Eser behemot mana katuv. The Torah actually enumerates 10 specific animals, v'tu lo. And if you look at the pasuk, this is a pasuk in Dvarim in Re'eh. It says Ayal utzvi v'yachmar ako dishon to'ov v'zamar. Those are 7 of the chayot, and then there's the 3 behemot, which Rashi quotes, whatever they are. Shar sek savim seizin, right? Ayal. So Ayal, I guess, is the fourth domestic, and then there's six wild ones, or chayot. And since this is not mentioned, there's no category of Iza Debala, they must be within the category of Sek Safim Seizim, and therefore they are considered to be a behema. Hani midaloka chashavlu b'hadi b'chayot. Since these are not counted as a distinct category of chayot, shmamina de iznenu. They're within the larger category of izim. What are you talking about? Why don't you read the pasuk completely differently? The pasuk says ayal tzvi, right? And then the pasuk continues. I didn't read the next pasuk, which is pasuk vav in Perik Yud Daled in Dvarim, and then it continues and says, so I'll read it again. Ayal tzvi yachmar ako dishon te'ova zamar. Then the next pasuk says v'chol behema mafreset parsa v'shusat shesa. Any animal that's got split hooves and chews its cud is kosher for you to eat. So says Rav Acha bar Yaakov, why don't you read it as the first pasuk is ayal, tzvi, etc., are prat. These are specifics. Kol behema, which is really vichol behema is a klal. The next pasuk of all animals that have simanim are kosher. It tells you everything. Prat uklal, nasa klal, mosif ala prat. The rule of klal, prat uklal, which is a rare one, we don't usually have that one, is that you add many, many things. The Torah gives you a few, and the klal tells you add everything. You can add 1,000 species. Ikatuva, right? Maybe there are many, many more species of chayot. Says the Gemara, well, that's possible, but then why would you have to list out 10 specific ones, right? Say two and then a klal. Imkain kol hani prati lamali. Why would you need all of these pratim? So therefore, it's not read as a klal prat, it's read as individual things. Says the Gemara, but so matkef ravacha breid ravika, v'dilma mina da ako ninu. But the Torah does say ako, and ako, at least in my English, translates this as a wild goat. So maybe this is a type of wild goat. It's a mountain goat. Why are you so confident it's a behema goat? Maybe it's a chaya goat. Amar le Ravacha breid Rav Larashi, Amar le Ravacha breid Rav Avia Ravashi. Well, it could also be mina de to, right? Dema mina de to. I might translate to as wild, and it doesn't translate to oryx. You know what an oryx is? Some kind of animal. Okay, maybe it's a type of oryx, Auroch. Oh, Nina de Zemer. Now, Zemer in mine is translated as a wild sheep, right? Again, these are wild animals that resemble domesticated animals, Ninhu. Amrle, Rav Chanan Ravashi, said Rav Chanan Ravashi, Meimar Shari Tarbayo. In fact, Meimar said that in these animals, these wild goats are chayot, and you can, in fact, eat the fat of the animals. Remember, the chelev is mutar from a wild animal, but asur in a domestic animal. Okay. Anyway, so clearly we don't know for sure. Abba Breidrav Minyamin Barchia Mirafuna Barchia asked this interesting named Amora, right? Asked of Rabbi Ravuna Barchia, Hani easy debala maulagabi misbeach, right? The easy debala, which we have just had a big machlok at, as to whether or not they're chayot or behemot, these are the mountain goats, or the forest goats, we call them. Are they kosher on the mizbeach as a behema? Are they chaya? Amani said, well, I can lo pligi Rabbi Rabbanan al b'shar habar. We quoted a machloket earlier between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan about a shar habar. We didn't quote it yet, so we're about to quote it. It's not. What does the Mishnah say in Kilayim? Shar habar min behemahu. A shar habar, which literally means a same, right? We had the word bar before. Bar literally means forest or wild. So a forest ox, right? So not one that lives on your farm, says the Mishnah, it's a min behemahu. It's considered to be a behema, and therefore you put it on the mizbeach, and the chelav is aser, and all the regular halachot, no kisoy adam, etc. Rabbi Yossi says min chaya. Rabbi Yossi says no, it's actually a type of chaya, and therefore you can't put it on the mizbeach, and you have to cover the blood, and you can eat the chelav. What's the machloket? The Rabbanan Savri that the midraminan turbala, right? The targum of the word, shar. Rashi says, sorry, ta'o. Right? The targum of the word te'o, which Rashi seems to have that gear, so we don't quite have it. But remember, one of the things in the list in the pasuk was dishon te'o v'zemer. And I said before to was an arak, because mine said that. The targum of the word to is turbala, right? A turbala, now what does turbala stand like? Sounds like in Aramaic, a tor bala, a shore of the forest. Right? So clearly you see that because that's the Targum, it's considered to be min de behemahu. It's considered to be a behema. And Rabbi Yossi says, well, that I just say the exact opposite, because if you look at the list in the pasuk, it's surrounded by akod dishon ti'ov zemer. That's the list of chayot. So it means chashav lebahadi chayot, midi the chayot. So it's a chaya. Anyway, so that's the machloket. Interesting. I
It's a
don't think that's
desert antelope.
right. I don't think it's the same. They tend to spell differently. Auroch.
Oh, aura.
Aura. I think because it should be a kind of bull in this context. Sharabar.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Claudia's a beautiful picture. I could show it on the camera if everyone can see that of some scary looking animal. Okay. Aval hani divrei Yaakov mina de'eznenu. But the truth is, by these, everyone would agree that it's a type of an ace. Matkefa ravacha b'ed ravika dama mina de'akoninu. Similar question, right? Maybe it's a type of akko. Amar le Ravina Ravashi, the same question you asked before. Dama mina de te'o, o mina de zemenu. Again, these are all quoted in the pasuk as wild animals. Amar le Rav Nachman Ravashi, Ameimar Shar Tabayo. Again, going back to what we said before, Ameimar said that they are a chaya and you can eat the fat. So clearly, we do not have easy resolution in our Gemara about some of these complex animals that are, not clearly domestic, not clearly wild. They certainly look at the same species, but there's very important implications between whether a behema, again, kosher doesn't matter whether it's a behema or a chaya. Kosher is based on simanim. If it has split hooves and chews its cud, and we learned all about kosher, right? Um, but you need to know whether it's a chay or behema for many reasons, including gifts to the Kohen, covering the blood, eating the chalev, and then in our parak, otovet beno, because there's certainly opinions that not everyone agrees that otovet beno only applies to a behema, does not apply to a chaya. So
Yeah.
some of this is left open, and I can't tell you what to do if you bump into a wild boar.
Yeah. Because they were the ancestors of domesticated bulls, and the last individual apparently died in 1627.
Okay, I don't know if you heard that from Claudia, that these are extinct according to the internet. That these.
Yeah, I sent actually into the chat,
Oh, thank
not
you.
in the chat in the group, like in the WhatsApp group.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that is very interesting discussion. It says now we're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah gave, and it was a very lengthy Mishnah, but it's going to make for an easy daf today because the Mishnah covered everything. The Mishnah, if you recall, had all of these examples. It was like a whole day, right, 2 days ago, of how if you shech this one first and then you shech the next one. Remember, the only time you're chayiv in otovet beno is if the first one is done properly. Then the second child or mother, you can go in that way, but you'd be chayiv for otovet beno. But remember all the cases where you have kachim. Let's say you shech your kachim outside, so that's shchutei chutz. So then, if you then shech that child afterwards, it's not otovet beno because the first shchita was done improperly, right? And we went on and on with like 20 examples of that. So it says the Gemara now, 4 lines from the bottom of Daf Peyam and Aleph. Ketzad, Hashochet, and etc., etc., etc. Amr Rav Oshaya says, Rav Oshaya, I just want to make one point to you that this entire Mishnah cannot go according to Rabbi Shimon. Kulu matit and Rabbi Shimon. It can't go like Rabbi Shimon. Now, this is a little bit of a preview of tomorrow's daf because we're actually going to have Rabbi Shimon in a Mishnah tomorrow, and Rabbi Shimon is going to say in the Mishnah tomorrow, which is on Pei Aleph on bet, is that if you basically shecht an animal and you find out that the animal is treifa, for example, says Rabbi Shimon, that's not considered to be shchita for otovet beno, because you have to have a shchita that's ru'uya la'achila, basically. And so tavach v'hachein is going to darshan. You have to shecht it and then eat it, right? If you can't eat it because you shechted it avodah zara or because it was a treifa or all kinds of reasons, then it's not considered to be a shchita to mechayev you on otovet beno. And so, according to Rabbi Shimon, you go back to our Mishnah, many of the cases in our Mishnah don't work out. Because let's say you shechted for shchutei chutz with the first animal. Well, that animal's puzzle. So then the next animal is never going to be otovet beno, right? So therefore, that's what our Gemara is going to point out. The Mishnah can't be going like Rabbi Shimon. Mimai, midikaktani, for example, one of the cases in the Mishnah was if you have kudshim, right, and bechutz, and you shech two animals of kudshim bechutz, a mother and a child, on the same day, harishon chayiv karet, because of shchutei chutz. Ushneim pesulim, they're both pasul. Ushneim sufkinet arba'im. You get makot for both, right? Why do you get makot for the second one? Because michti. Shamina leila Rabbi Shimon, we're going to find out. Rabbi Shimon says tomorrow, Damar shchita she'en ruya lo shma shchita. Rabbi Shimon's going to say that a shchita that is not ra'oi, meaning it does not result in you being able to eat this animal, is not considered a shchita. In which case, if the first one is shchutei chutz of kachim, kama mikdal katle, right? The first animal is not considered to be a shchita; it's considered to be a murder, we'll call it, or killing an animal, but not a shchita. In which case, the second one obviously is not going to be otovet beno, right? It's not going. And remember, the problem with animal whose mother was shechted on that day, the words we use are called mechusar zman, right? It's not the right time for that animal to be a karban. right? The Torah specifically says an animal that's not 8 days old cannot be a karban, but we extend that if you shechted the mother, then for the rest of that day, the animal can be 4 years old. So for the rest of that day, it is mechusar zman, and therefore, if you brought on a karban, it would be pasul. But according to Rabbi Shimon, that's not true because you didn't shech the mother; you killed the mother, right? There's no prohibition of killing two animals on the same day, and so sheni mitkabel bifnimu. Right? The second one is now able to be brought bifnim, and therefore, if you shecht it outside, you're chayiv karet, like shchutei chutz. Remember, any animal that you can bring inside that you do outside, if it's a karban, you're chayav karet for shchutei chutz. The reason the Mishnah said you weren't chayav karet for the second animal is because since you shechted the mother, you couldn't shecht the child, and therefore it's not a karban bifnim, and it can't. There, when you do it outside, you're not chayav karet. Right? So why couldn't Rabbi Shimon? That would not be true. Sheni mitkabel bifnimhu v'karet nami chayav. Right? And then the next case, we're at the second line of Peyam Mebet. Chullin, right? We said, what about the case of animals that are not kachim or chulin? Bifnim, and you did them inside the Beit HaMikdash, which is chulin and asa bifnim is wrong. Said the Mishnah, shneim psulim, they're both pasul, but sheni sofegat arba'im. The second one you get makot for otovet beno, right? But why? Michti, shamina le Rabbi Shimon damashchita shenu ruya lo shmashchita. So kama, the first one is mikdal katle, right? You can't eat this animal because it's chulin and asa bifnim. Right? It's chulin that's done in the Beit HaMikdash. You'd have to throw it away. So because you can't eat it, it's not a shchita. It's just a killing. And so therefore, sheni amay sofegat arba'im. Why do you get makot for the second one? It should be kachim. It should be, yeah, sorry. Period. Am I so vegetarian? I'm just got to get the periods here. So why do you get makot on the second one if it's not otovet beno, right? You didn't kill shech the mother and the child on the same day. You killed the mother and then shechted the child, which is not otovet beno. And then the next case in the Mishnah, we're 6 lines from the top, second to last word on the line. Kachim bifnim, right? We said if you have kachim and you do it inside, harishon kasher, because you're bringing a karban in the Beit HaMikdash, that's normal. Upatur, you're patur on, there's nothing wrong. Hasheni sofegat arba'im upasul. The second animal, you get makot because otovet beno, you shechted the mother and then you get it. But says the Gemara, I don't get it. So says the Gemara, interesting thing. Every shchita of a karban in the Beit HaMikdash should be considered shchita she'ena ruya. Why? Because a karban doesn't become permitted until you sprinkle the blood. So the moment with the domestic animal, a chulin animal, you shecht it, you can eat it, right? You have to cook it, but you can eat it. But you can eat it raw, but you can eat it right away. But a karban, right, in the Beit HaMikdash, every shchita is not a shchita that is ru'uya, because there's a step after the shchita of pouring the blood on the mizbeach before you can eat it. So shchitat kadshim nami, shchita she'en ru'uyahi, every shchitat kachim should be called shchita she'en ruya. The kama de lozarik dam lo mystery basar. The meat is not mutar to eat, and so in this case, you shechted the mother as a karban bifnim, as a kosher karban, but then you shechted the child. Whatever, it doesn't matter where, but let's just say you shechted the child. Sheni amay sofeget arba'im pasul. Why would you then get makot for shechting the second one as someone who shechted a mother and a child? The first shchita should not be called shchita. Elishmamina to lo Rabbi Shimon. So you see from all of this, multiple cases, and we can actually go through the Mishnah and get even more, that the Mishnah is not going like Rabbi Shimon. Says the Gemara, okay, you're so clever and intelligent, I would have figured it out myself. Shita de. Yeah, anyone who learns tomorrow's daf, maybe you just help me get tomorrow, and knows Rabbi Shimon's opinion would understand that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Shimon. Says, well, you're right. But the reason we spoke this whole thing out is because shchitat kachim mitzrichale. Let's tell you the last case of the shchita of kachim, because that is a very, significant halacha that, according to Rabbi Shimon, every time you do shchita of a karban, it's considered to be a shchita she'en ruya, and you can't have otovet beno on the child. Because I would have thought shchitat kachim. Well, it's a shchita ru'uyahi. It's definitely, you did a proper shchita. Why? How do I know that? Right? Let's say you stab the animal and then you sprinkle the blood. That's obviously not kosher, right? Lo mystery basar. Clearly, the shchita is necessary, obviously, as part of the karban. Ki shachat mishtere basar. Right? When you shach the animal and then sprinkle the blood, that's how you are kosher, make the meat kosher. So the shchita is it's not, when you say it's shchita she'en ruya, it's true, it's not kosher the moment you do shchita, but it's an essential kosher part of this animal. So you might have thought Shchita ru'yahi. Kamashmalan that even there, Rabbi Shimon would say it's not a shchita ru'ya, and this, of course, would have huge implications in the case where you shechted a mother as a karban, and then you took the baby home and you said, "Well, let me have that for my own meal." According to Rabbi Shimon, that's not a problem of tovet beno, because the shchita of the mother is not considered to be a shchita ru'ya. Okay, don't try it at home because the Chachamim would say it is. Okay. Says the Gemara now, one last question before we finish today's daf. Well, this will take us to the end of the daf. What about, there's another lotase, right? Our Mishnah kept talking about you get makot for, we talked about shchutei chutz, but you get makot mostly for oto ve'etz beno. But what about the fact that there's a prohibition, a lotase of mechusar zman, right? Meaning the Torah says every animal, I forgot the exact words, maybe I have it on mine. Nope, where it says up to the 8th day, Yom HaShmini, right? Shivat Yomim Yetachat Imo, Yom HaShmini V'Hala Yeratzeh, right? So I forgot the exact words, but it's something like that, right? So there's a very specific pasuk about. I don't have it. Okay, we'll get there. About mechusar zman. So about 7 days, right? Animal that's born, it should be 7 days under its mother, and you can't bring it as a karban. And then the 8th day and on, you can bring it as a karban l'ratzot in front of Hashem. Okay, I can't believe I don't have it. Anyways, oh, here we go. I do have it. Vayikra chav bet chav zayin. Shar kesef ha'ez ki yivaled. Hayash shivat yamim tachat imo. A shar kesef and ez when it gives birth, let the child be under its mother for 7 days. Umiyom hashmini v'hala yiratzeh lekarban ishel Hashem. On the 8th day and on, you can do it as a karban. So ask our Gemara, why don't you say that there's a lotase of mechusar zman? That if you shecht an animal in the first 6 to 7 days, you're chayv a lotase. Otovet bno is the same mechusar zman, because although the animal's 3 years old, the day you shecht its mother, it becomes no longer shechtable today. So lilki nami mishum lav the mechusar zman. Why don't you say that the second animal you get makot, not just for otovet bno, but also for a lav and mechusar zman, that you shecht an animal who's in the wrong time. The Tanya. Now, what's the basis for this? Because there's a brayta that says, I'm at the fourth last narrow line, Minayin the cholap sulim shebishar shebeseh shubalo yiratzeh. I know that all the animals that are pasul, right, that you're not allowed to bring as a karban because it is got a mum, let's say, we'll see what they are in a second. You are over lo yiratzeh, meaning not if you take an animal that has a mum that can't be a karban and you bring it, we don't just say bad job. We give you lotase because the Torah says don't bring an inappropriate animal, and you brought an inappropriate animal. Talmud Omer, therefore we learn, the pasuk tells us, it says v'shar v'seh, if you have a shar, a bull, or a lamb, that is sarua v'kalut, right? These are the mumim of an animal, which we'll have in next Masechta Mechorot. Sarua we translate as being too big, and kalut means cut off, it's too short, and it goes on and on, iver piseach, etc. This teaches you that any time an animal is pasol to be brought on the mizbeach, it is considered to be lo yiratzeh. So if you have an animal whose mother was shechted, you can't shecht it on that day. It's as if it has a mum, or it's as if it's mechusar zman. You should be chayav for a separate lo taseh of lo yiratzeh. Answers him where you are, but we don't mention that in the Mishnah. Ki kachashiv le lavd oto ve'etz beno. Our Mishnah is focused on our parak, oto ve'etz beno. Are you over a lo taseh for oto ve'etz beno? Lavi nuchra'i, it's a very funny term, right? Foreign lavim, meaning extraneous lavim, lo kachashiv. That's not our business, right? We're not, yeah, they're out of the, nachrim is the word, right? They're not part of this Mishnah. Says, okay, that's a great answer, but it's not true in the Mishnah. Because if you recall, our Mishnah talked about cases where you did shchutei chutz, and we said you get a lo taseh for shchutei chutz, which is not related. Below, the hakadshim bechutz, the lav nuchra'inin hu v'kachashiv, right? The question of whether you shecht an animal outside the Beit HaMikdash, it's roy to be brought inside, and you get makot, the Mishnah mentions that as a lo taseh. Dikatani. Now we're quoting the Mishnah. Let's say you have a case where you do kadshim bechutz, right? You do a karban outside, and then you do a second karban that's kosher, Chullin, let's say. We said a rishon chayav karet, because shchutei chutz that you've done, that's a karban that could be brought inside, which is the first one, is karet. Ushnehem sufkin et arba'im. You get makar on both, right? Now, I understand the second one, bishul masheni, the second animal you get makot because of otovet beno, mishum lav otovet beno. But why are you getting makot for the first one? El rishona my sofeg, it must be because mishum lav mishum lav d'shchutei chutz, right? It's because it was done outside. And you're claiming that we don't mention other lotases in our Mishnah that are not otovet beno. No, you missed the point. The point was there's no otovet beno on the first animal, right? The first animal is the parent, or it could be the child, but it doesn't matter. There's no otovet beno when there's the first one. So there we mention your chayav alotase of shchutei chutz. But with the second animal, you're really chayav two lotases, one of otovet beno and one of lo yiratzeh. But there we only mention the main one. So kol hecha deleka lav de otovet beno. If there's no lav otovet beno to mention, then we do mention chashiv lavin yechroi. We mention the external lavin, in this case shchutei chutz. But if there is otovet beno, then we just mention that one. Lo chashiv lavin nuchrai, we don't mention external lavin. And so therefore, that's why in our Mishnah, we don't mention that you're chayav alotase for mechusar zman, which is lo deiratzeh, but in fact you are. And in fact, there's a separate lotase essentially on every otovet beno that's brought in the Beit Hamikdash, right? That if you bring an animal inside, it's an isser of otovet beno if its mother was shechted that day, and it's an isser of lo yiratzeh. That's the first answer. We're going to do one more answer because we have time, even though it's getting there. A few more lines. Rabbi Zera says, I have a different answer. The different answer is that there is no prohibition of makot on the lava mechusar zman. Hanach the mechusar zman, leave aside. Don't mention the lotase of mechusar zman, because although it is a lotase, it's not a chiyav of makot, because hakatuv, there's a lot of different girsot here, but hakatuv nitko la'aseh. The Torah connects it to an aseh, right? Tosas has a simpler shot than Rashi, but Tosas says something to the extent that basically the Torah doesn't. So nitko la'aseh usually means it's fixed by an aseh, right? Don't leave over your notar, and if you leave it over, burn it in the morning. So it's a classic lavanitak la'aseh. A notar mimenu araboker be'ish yisrofo, right? Don't leave it over, and if you do, burn it. So therefore, you're not chayav a makot for that lotaseh. This clearly, there's no fixing this. So Rashi has a complicated explanation that basically, during the time that it's 7 days, it's lo yiratzeh, but after that time, it's basically saying you should do it, right? And therefore, because the way the Torah corrects it, it's not considered to be a traditional lav, it's considered to be a lav hanitak la'aseh. My time, and let's read that in the pasuk. What's the reason at the top line of Daf Pei Aleph Amud Aleph? Because the pasuk says miyom hashmini v'hala yiratzeh, that from the 8th day and on you can do it. Right, that's the pasuk I quoted. That shivat yamim tachat imo umiyom hashmini v'hala yiratzeh lekrabani shel Hashem. When the Torah is specifically telling you miyom hashmini in meikaralo, and from the 8th day you could do it. Earlier you can't do it, but this is a lav haba michlal asay, but this we consider it to be you learn that don't do it earlier from the fact that you can do it later, and therefore we treat it like an asay, right? So I'll leave it there because it's complicated, but we basically mix two things, right? There's lava b'machlal asay and there's lava nitak asay, and we're sort of mixing them both together here. But for whatever reason, Rabbi Zera is basically saying that you wouldn't get makot for this lotasay. It would be a lotasay because it's lava b'machlal asay or it's lava nitak asay, but the makot would only be from otovet beno. And it's not the end of the sugya, but this is how Daf Yomi loves to do it. We stop at the end of the daf, so we are at the 4th line of Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Eli. Shabbat tov.
Shabbat tov.